In this video, we're going to dive a little bit deeper into the state machine and behaviors. In the last video, we learned the basics of the state machine and how to create a behavior so that our buckets would both move back and forth to be able to catch the ball using our keyboard left and right arrow keys. We're going to expand a little bit more. To make this scene work, this training simulator scene, there's a lot of behaviors we need to add onto our scene and onto different entities. So we're going to dive a little bit deeper into the state machine. Especially, we're going to be looking at events. Events are the idea of a behavior that emits a message out into your scene and that other behaviors can listen to that event to initiate their own behaviors. So we're going to dive a little bit deeper into all of that as well. In this video, we're going to learn about behaviors, event emitters, and event listeners. So let's get started. Okay, this is our scene that we have built out so far. And remember, if I press play, let's just see what we have. If I press play, our ball falls down to the table, and I can move our buckets back and forth using my arrow keys to catch the sphere or the game ball. Now, that's not exactly what we want to do to have as an end product. So we need to add more onto it. We need a lot more behaviors to make this all work. However, to get started, we need to have some sort of switch. So we want to make it so that when I enter into VR, if you remember, I touch the start button to get everything going. So we need to do that. So before I can really even do behaviors, I need to quickly create a switch that we can tap with a controller. So to do that, we're just going to create an entity and add a box. And the details of this, specifics of how this looks and these dimensions, it's not really important. This is really just for aesthetics. Okay, so I'm going to so all I'm doing is just adding a box, and I'm changing some dimensions here a little bit. And bring it down there. Okay. All right. So we're just adding a box. Okay. So I got my box there, and that's really just going to be a kind of a holding spot for my start button. So I'll add a start button by clicking Create Entity again and adding a 2D shape, which is a triangle. Triangle comes in rather large, if you see here. So we need to rotate it around the y-axis 90 degrees, and then we need to tilt this around the z-axis 90 degrees. And let's bring this down to 0.01. 0.05. Nope. We need to do 0.1. 0.1. 0.1. That's still a little bit too big. So let's just do 0.5. Oops, no, I'm sorry. 0.05. 0.05. 0.05. That's almost there. Let's go to 4. Good. And I'm just going to place this right here on the box, fairly close. All right. I don't want it to be gray, so I'm going to open up the 2D graphics tab and change the color to green. Something like that. All right. Now, to be able to trigger this with our controller, we need to add on a collider that I clicked out of the triangle. We need to add a collider and then add the trigger option. So I'm going to go add component. And remember, all of this will make sense when we tie it all together. I know it can be a little bit confusing when we're having all these different state machines. They all will work together and they all make sense. So if you can just follow along, at the very end, I'll make sure to explain how they all connect together. Now see, right now I have a box-shaped collider, which is fine around this triangle. I need to make it a little bit bigger though, because the box is very small for this collider. So I want to extend it that way, and then also, nope, not that way. Don't need to move it on the z-axis. I always actually kind of forget sometimes the x, y, and z, which ways goes which. So there we go. That's our collider. Now I want to be able to make it a trigger so that when we touch it with our controllers, something can happen. So to do that, we need to click the trigger option. Okay, great. All right, so now we have our start button. Now we need to add a behavior that can start all of the initiate all the other behaviors. So essentially our start behavior or our start game behavior. So I'm going to add a component. I'm going to add a state machine. I'm going to add a new behavior. I'm going to name it. We're going to have several behaviors, so I would highly recommend that you rename your behaviors accordingly. It makes it a lot easier. All right, so the first thing we want to do is make sure that we can click or tap on this behavior using our controllers. And so we're going to do we're going to call this first state. Click, and then that's just naming it. Now we need to add an action. And we're going to search for the same thing. Click or tap on entity. And then another very important one is on trigger enter, or just trigger enter. Now we're doing this two ways because we want to be able to start it with our mouse so we can click on it, or we can trigger it entering. The trigger enter will be initiated by the controller when it physically touches or virtually physically touches the triangle or the start button. Again, we want to be able to test it on our desktop, so we need to be able to click it with our mouse as well. So that's our first state. We're going to add another state. And we're going to call this one emit. And we're going to add an action called emit message. Now, the action that we have attached to this state, you see here, emit message, there's a channel text box. This is the message that's going to be emitted when this state, when it transitions to this state. So we'll emit out into the scene that this message has been triggered. So the channel message, it can be anything, but we'll keep it simple. Start. That's what we want to emit out into the world. Now we don't have a transition action yet, so we do need to add one because we wanted to continue to do one other thing, which is we just needed to search for transition. This will enable us to transition to another state. And we'll add another state. We'll move that over here. And we just want to change color. So we want to know visually if we've touched the start button. So we're just going to change the color of this triangle. And let's do that by adding action and a set material color. That's what I needed. Set material color. All right, so we chose some sort of green here as its current color. We want to go a little bit just darker green. This can really be whatever color you want. Okay, good. And one thing I do want to do is change the name of this start button to start button. That works. Now, because I'm going to be dealing with a lot of behaviors, I'm going to filter my assets panel down to my behaviors. So you see the behaviors icon right over here, almost to the far right. I'll click on that. And there I see my behaviors. I can easily access all of my behaviors. So I go back to my start game, and I have these three states. Now I need to connect them with transitions. So I'm just going to click on each action here in the click state and transition over to the emit. Then the emit one, we want to transition over to the change color. So again, what happens here is that when I play let's actually just show you. I'll play my state, or play my scene. And to start, this isn't going to do anything quite yet, but it will shortly. So I can start my scene by clicking on this button here. It will then emit a message, and then change the color of the start button. There we go. So you see it ended up here, it changed color, it did change the color. To do that, it did go through the emit message. It just did it very quickly, so you may have not been able to see it, but it did emit that message. It emitted the start message out into the scene. So good, we are off to a good start. The next behaviors we want to create or add to our scene will be behaviors that are specific to the buckets. So that when the ball drops in the bucket and it collides with if you remember, I'm going to open up my buckets here. If you remember, each one has this trigger box down here, so that when this ball touches or enters into that trigger button, or trigger bucket, or trigger box, another message can be emitted. So that's what we need to do. So essentially, so that when the ball falls into this bucket or in that bucket, a message is emitted that will continue on another behavior that we will get to shortly. So let's go ahead and do that. So the entity we want to add this behavior to is the trigger box. So I will click the trigger box, I will add component, and we'll add a state machine. Let's make sure that we do have the trigger enabled on the collider. We do. We're going to add a new behavior, and we'll call this blue trigger because this is on the true blue trigger box. And for this first state, we're just going to name it trigger enter. And we're going to add an action. I only changed the name. I haven't added an action yet. And so I'm going to now search for the action trigger enter. If you haven't figured it out, I think it's a good idea to have the name of your state match the action that is applied to that state. It makes it a lot easier. But you got to remember that when you change the name of a state, you're not adding an action yet. You're just changing the name. Sometimes it can be confusing, or you just think that you did it because you typed it out. But you got to make sure you do add the action. All right, let's add another state. And the only thing we want this to do is emit. So we're going to go add action. And we'll look for emit message. And the message channel, the channel message we're going to add to it is into bucket blue. And notice that my I and my B and my other B are all capitalized. Into bucket blue. Capitalizations are really, really important here with emitting messages and listening to events. So far we've added a few actions that emit messages. We will create a message or a behavior that will listen to these messages to do something with it. So again, we will tie it all together shortly. I'll add action, and I'll search for just transition, because if you notice, there's no way to transition back to this one, which I do need to do. So we'll click add action and just look for the transition action. And these we're just going to connect together. So I'll transition to this one and transition to this one. The trigger enter, though, we want to make sure is set as the initial state, so that when we go in play mode, this is the state that it is set to. Okay, great. All right. Now I'm going to do something really, really similar to the blue trigger. I really need to make an exact copy of the blue trigger and apply it to the orange bucket trigger, or the trigger box. However, we don't want to do. We do want to change one thing, but it's going to be almost an exact copy. So instead of starting from scratch, I'm just going to duplicate this. And you see we have blue trigger 2. I'm going to change the name to orange trigger. And again, trigger enter will transition to the emit state. But we do want to change or alter the channel message to into bucket orange instead of into bucket blue. So that is the one difference. Now, one thing, so I created this action. This is a really important step that I often forget myself. I created this behavior, but I've not yet applied it to my orange bucket trigger box. So in my trigger box here, I see I don't even have a state machine applied to it. So I'm just going to add a state machine component. Now we already created the behavior. And so what I can do is just drag it, the orange trigger. Oops, I didn't do that right. I can just drag the orange trigger behavior over here onto the drop behavior input. Once I do that, now you see the orange trigger there. Similarly, if I look at my trigger, my blue bucket trigger, see how the blue trigger is applied to it. So again, even though you make the behavior, see we copied it in the asset panel and then we altered the behavior a little bit, you do have to make sure that you then apply that behavior to the correct entity. All right, so there we go. So now we have a blue trigger, an orange trigger, and a start game. And we do have the bucket move for PC, but that's just so we can move the buckets back and forth. The last behavior we're going to make in this video is the game ball behavior. This is our largest behavior, and it's going to have the most happening into it with it, but it's also going to connect with the 3 other behaviors we've already created. So let's get started on that one. All right, so let's see what we need to do. We need to add a behavior or a state machine to our game ball. Where is our game ball? There it is, right in front of me. We will click Add Component, and then State Machine. And there's no behaviors attached to it, so we will create a new behavior. And I'm going to call this one Game Ball Behavior. I shouldn't say this is our most important behavior because we need all of the behaviors for this to function. This is just kind of our largest, most involved behavior, if you will. So to get this moving, what we need to do is this needs to start somehow. So remember how we created a start game behavior that emitted a message, the message start, and that we need to use that message to then get this behavior started. So remember, we are applying this to the game ball itself. Just clicked out of it. There we go. All right, so I'm just going to call this one listen, and we need a corresponding action that we're going to look for. Listen. Let's go back to this. All right, so the listen message, or the listen behavior, listen state has the listen action attached to it. What message do we need it listening to? Start. That's going to get this whole thing rolling. The next state we're going to add is execute script expression. I'm actually just going to go and wait. It's kind of a long name, but just to describe what's happening here. All right, so the first thing we need to do is add an action to this one and execute script. Now what this is doing is that when it actually, I did not do the right one. Execute script expression. That's the one I want. Execute script expression. Now, what we want this to actually do, and remember, you can find all these materials in the downloadable asset pack that you downloaded at the very beginning of this tutorial series, and you can find all of these script expressions and everything in there. So I'm going to add the script expression, which is, let me pull this out a little bit more so you can see it. CTX entity.rigidBodyComponent.is kinematic equals false. Won't worry too much about what this is doing, but this is essentially allowing the ball, ensuring that the ball, the game ball, will respond to gravity. That's what this script expression is doing. The next action we want to add is a wait action. Just so it'll pause for a second, because we want to be able to click on the button, and then we want this script expression executed, but we do want to then pause it for a little bit so the user can look up and just be able to give them a little bit of time to see what's happening. So instead of 5,000 milliseconds, which is 5 seconds, we're just going to do 500 milliseconds, which is 5 seconds, or half a second. All right, the next state we want to add is a random state. And we're going to add an action and search for random. This is an interesting action in that what it will do is when the behavior transitions to this state, it will then transition either to the random outcome A or random outcome B. And the probability of A is set to 0.5, and also meaning that the random outcome of B, the probability is also 0.5. So that half the time it'll randomly go to A, other time it'll randomly go to B. We'll see why that's important in a moment. We'll continue going to our next state. And we're going to call this state blue reposition. This is going to have several actions attached to it. The first is set material color. So right now we want the ball to be blue. Sometimes we want the ball to be orange sometimes. So we need to do that by here in this state. I'm going to match my hex color. And I would encourage you to do whatever color you want, but it might make sense if it matches the color of the bucket. All right, so it's going to change the color blue, and I'm going to drag my game ball into the drop entity so it knows to apply it to that specific entity. We're then going to add an action, set script. Keep doing that wrong. Execute script expression again. The script expression that we want to be executed here is ctx.worlddata.ballcolor equals blue. We are going to add a script here soon to our scene. So there's going to be a little bit of scripting involved in this tutorial. And essentially we want to tell that script that the ball is now blue. Even though it is changed the color blue, we need to tell the script that it is blue. And so that's what we're defining here. So that this scene will know that the ball is now turned blue. This is a blue ball. The final action we need to add is a transition so that we can transition to something else. And you can always move these around. Great. All right. I need to do a very similar action or state for the orange bucket, or for the orange ball, I should say. And so I'm just going to go ahead and duplicate this state, but instead of blue, I'm going to change it to orange. And then, this is very important here, down in the script expression, we're changing the expression message to orange. Got to make sure we keep those quotes as well. All right, so let's just ensure that we have this correct. And again, this expression can be found in the asset pack that we provided it, that you're supposed to download as a prerequisite for this course. ctx.worlddata.ballcolor equals orange, in quotes. Okay. Next, we need to add another state. And this one's going to be called wait for trigger. This is going to have several actions attached to it. First, we want to add a listen action. And the message it's listening to is into bucket orange. We want to add another action, also a listen. This one's going to be into, got to make sure that my capitals are correct, into bucket blue. Should actually move this one. Blue is always above orange, typically, at least just so in my organization. So I like to keep it like that, just so I can see everything clearly. The next action we want to do is set rigid body position. And we're going to make this 4, 4, and 0. That position is roughly right up here, a little bit higher than where the ball currently is. We're just trying to reposition the ball above the table somewhere. So that should work. Next, we're going to add another action, set rigid body velocity. And we're not actually going to change any of these positions. We're just going to leave it as is and then add action again. Set rigid body angular velocity. And similarly, we're not going to change anything, any of these values. So we have a set rigid body position set at 4 on the x value or axis, 4 on the y value, and 0 on the z. And that'll position the ball right up here somewhere so that when it's repositioned, it'll then fall. So it's kind of like spawning the ball in a new position. And then we'll set the rigid body. Oh, I didn't do this right. I'm going to remove this action. Here we go. This is what I wanted to get. Set rigid body position. So we have 4, 4, 0. Set rigid body velocity 0, 0, 0. Set rigid body angular velocity 0, 0, 0. My apologies. Make sure you go ahead and get these 3 actions there. But the second 2 you don't need to actually change. The last action we want to add is a show action. Meaning if something is hidden within our scene, it will then show it. Okay. Now the way this works, or the way we need to wire this up with transitions, is the listen. Once it hears that event start, it will transition to this execute script. It'll execute the script that defines that the ball is not kinematic, and so it can fall to gravity. It'll wait half a second. And then it'll transition to this random. The random transition will then transition randomly to either the blue reposition or the B reposition. Notice that I'm pulling a transition from one of each of these. So when it goes to the blue reposition, or if it goes to the blue reposition, it will change the color to blue. It'll execute this script expression which tells the scene that the ball is blue, defined as blue, and then it will transition to this wait for trigger. Same thing happens when the orange reposition, that when it'll execute that, or it'll change the ball to orange. Oh, I didn't actually change this color to orange. That's an important one. Okay. There we go. So blue reposition and orange reposition, make sure you change those colors. It'll also execute a script expression that says that the ball is, if I can go over here, orange, which will then transition to the wait for trigger. Essentially what will happen is both of these buckets will be waiting to, it's waiting for the trigger to happen. And remember that when the ball enters either of these buckets, it'll emit a message. Once it hears that message, and it'll be waiting for that to be heard right here because it'll be waiting in this state until you can actually hear it, or until the ball falls into one of these 2 buckets. It'll then emit either the into bucket blue message or the into bucket orange message. It'll set the position and then go back to this random. And we want both of these to transition up there, back to the random state. So we have a slightly more complex behavior. All right, I want to test out how this works. But if you think about it, what's going to happen when I press play? The game ball currently is still gray and it falls down, and I'm not really sure what to do with this. So a quick fix to this is that I'm going to take this ball and just lower it down below my floor so I can't see it. Because I actually don't need to see this ball right away. I don't need to see the game ball. I clicked out of the game ball behavior. So I'm now going to press play. All right, so I put the ball down here below the floor just so we can't see it. And to avoid any more confusion, one thing I'm going to do is just hide the game ball so I can't see it at all. So it's below my floor, it's hidden. But remember that I also, on this wait for trigger state, I did add a show action. And what this show action does is then it will visually show the ball and negate really this hiding property that I added over here or selected over here, so that it will then appear above the table. So let's just see how that works. It'll make more sense once we actually go. I'm going to press play, And our ball, we can't see it. It's now actually falling below our scene, infinitely below. We can't see it at all, even so, because when we press play, we don't want to reposition and then see it, and yada, yada, yada. So right now, everything is just waiting for us to click this button, or this play button, start button, to get everything going. So let's click it and see what happens. All right, so we get an orange ball. We'll move the orange bucket over. There it is. Now I have a blue ball. So it's randomly giving me either a blue ball or an orange ball. Great, so everything is working correctly. Now, if I let the orange ball drop into the blue bucket, it will still keep working, but we're going to make something using a scorecard that will allow this to score whether or not we get it correctly. So we'll get to that next. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and stop my scene. For the most part, that completes the behaviors we're going to add to this scene. We are going to add another behavior in a few videos that's coming up here that will allow this table to start tilting to make this a little bit more difficult progressively as you continue through the experience. But for the most part, that's the way we got the game ball working. We got the game ball and these buckets communicating with each other, so we have a slightly complex or more complex behavior or connected behaviors and interactivity within our scene. That mostly concludes the majority of the behaviors that we're going to be using in this scene. So we have a working game ball so that when we press the play button, the ball will then drop to the table and roll down, and we can either put it into the orange bucket or the blue bucket. And then once that happens, it will recycle and then get added to the top of the scene again, and so we can continue that behavior. Remember, we're just testing on a PC, so we're just using our keyboard to control the movement of those buckets back and forth. This will be possible in VR shortly, once that will be a video later on. We're going to add one final behavior that will allow the table to start tilting up as you progressively move through the scene using counters and counter actions. So I hope you join us for that. But for now, that concludes this video. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you in the next one.